The blue glow of television screens flickered across millions of American living rooms on that cold December evening in 1991, casting shadows on faces frozen in disbelief. Margaret Chen sat forward on her floral sofa in Ohio, her coffee growing cold in trembling hands as the network anchor's voice cracked with the weight of history. Behind him, grainy footage showed the hammer and sickle descending from the Kremlin flagpole for the final time, replaced by the Russian tricolor in what seemed like a fevered dream. Her husband Tom reached for her hand without taking his eyes from the screen, both of them struggling to comprehend that the enemy that had haunted their entire adult lives was simply ceasing to exist. In Brooklyn apartments, in Kansas farmhouses, in Seattle high-rises, in Texas ranch homes, 70 million Americans watched the same impossible images. The Soviet Union, the nuclear-armed colossus that had defined their fears and shaped their nation's purpose for 45 years, was dissolving like morning fog. The silence in those living rooms carried the weight of decades, heavy with memories of drills and sirens and sleepless nights. Tom had been 19 when the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, and he remembered the exact moment his father's face had gone pale, reading the newspaper headline. Margaret whispered something about their children, about how they would grow up in a world she couldn't quite imagine, a world without the shadow. The anchor continued his narration, but most Americans had stopped listening to the words, lost instead in their own private reckonings with history. Some wept quietly, others sat stone-faced, while still others began reaching for their telephones to call siblings and parents and old friends. What do you say when your longest nightmare simply ends, not with the apocalypse you prepared for, but with a flag being lowered? Outside, winter darkness had settled over the nation, but inside those glowing rooms, something fundamental was shifting in the American soul. This was the moment dividing everything that came before from everything that would follow, and they knew it with the certainty of witnesses to revelation. The Cold War had ended not with missiles or invasions, but with a bureaucratic announcement and footage of a flag coming down, somehow making the victory feel both absolute and strangely hollow. The relief came in waves, washing over small-town America like a long-awaited rain after years of drought. In the back room of McCarthy's machine shop in Pennsylvania, 3 generations of workers stood together during their lunch break, cigarette smoke curling toward the fluorescent lights as they tried to articulate feelings they'd carried since childhood. Frank Kowalski, whose hands bore the scars of 30 years on the factory floor, kept shaking his head and repeating that he couldn't believe it, that he'd honestly thought he'd die waiting for the air raid sirens to finally scream. His son Danny nodded quietly, remembering the bomb shelter his father had dug in their backyard in the early 60s, how they'd stocked it with canned goods and water jugs like preparing for an underground eternity. The youngest worker, barely 20, couldn't fully grasp what the older men were feeling, couldn't understand the specific texture of fear that had colored every day of their lives. In a Veterans of Foreign Wars hall in Missouri, Korean War veterans sat around their usual table, their weathered faces reflecting something between vindication and exhaustion. Earl Thompson had lost his hearing in one ear at the Chosin Reservoir, and now he stared at his beer with eyes that had seen things he never spoke about except to the men in this room. They'd fought the Soviets' proxies in frozen mountains, while politicians called it a police action, had watched friends die in a war that ended without victory or purpose. Now the enemy behind that enemy had simply collapsed, and Earl couldn't decide whether that made those frozen nights mean something or nothing at all. His buddy James finally broke the silence, saying maybe they'd held the line long, enough for the whole rotten system to crumble from within, and the others wanted desperately to believe him. Suburban mothers across America felt something unlock in their chests that had been clenched tight since their own childhoods. Patricia Morrison in Michigan remembered being 7 years old, crouched under her school desk with her hands over her head, truly believing that thin wood could save her from atomic fire. She'd raised her own children with that same background radiation of dread, had kissed them goodbye each morning with a tiny voice in her head, wondering if this would be the day the missiles flew. Now she stood in her kitchen watching her daughter play in the yard, and for the first time in her life, she looked at the sky without that ancient fear. The bomb shelter catalogues she'd kept in a drawer suddenly seemed like artifacts from another civilization, relics of a nightmare that had finally released its grip. The emotion wasn't triumph exactly, but something quieter and more profound, like survivors emerging from a storm cellar to find their house still standing. These Americans had lived their entire lives with one finger on the pulse of apocalypse, had made every decision with nuclear annihilation as the backdrop, and now that backdrop had simply vanished. They'd survived, and that survival felt like both a victory and a mercy they hardly dared to accept. The victory celebrations erupted spontaneously across American cities, like champagne corks popping in unison, an unplanned chorus of relief that transformed ordinary streets into impromptu festivals of vindication. In Times Square, strangers embraced beneath the electronic billboards that had so often flashed warnings of Soviet aggression, their tears mixing with laughter as they shouted that it was over, that America had won without the world ending in fire. Office workers threw open windows dozens of stories above Manhattan, showering the crowds below with ticker tape and confetti made from shredded newspaper headlines that screamed of communist collapse. The scene echoed the celebrations of previous wars, but this time the enemy had surrendered not on a battlefield, but at the altar of their own failed ideology. And that made the triumph taste sweeter somehow, proof that ideas could defeat empires. In Washington, crowds gathered outside the White House waving American flags that snapped crisp in the December wind, their voices hoarse from chanting about freedom's victory over tyranny. Margaret Chen, whose parents had fled communist China decades earlier, held her infant son above her head so he could see this moment, telling him through tears that he'd live in a world where half the globe wasn't painted red with oppression. Beside her, a man in a business suit kept repeating that Reagan had been right all along, that standing firm and spending them into the ground had worked exactly as promised. Construction workers who'd taken early lunch stood on scaffolding cheering, their hard hats decorated with tiny flags, while taxi drivers leaned on their horns in a discordant symphony of celebration that echoed through the corridors of power where cold warriors had plotted strategy for half a century. The celebrations carried a distinctive flavor of ideological triumph, a sense that this wasn't merely geopolitical victory, but vindication of an entire way of life. In coffee shops and corner bars from Boston to Los Angeles, Americans raised glasses to the proposition that their system of democratic capitalism had proven itself superior through sheer endurance and prosperity. Philosophy professors and dock workers alike spoke in similar terms about how the Soviets had collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions, how central planning and totalitarian control had finally revealed themselves as fundamentally unsustainable. The conversations carried undertones of relief mixed with satisfaction, the pleasure of being proven right after decades of intellectual and cultural warfare fought in universities, newspapers, and living rooms across the nation. Yet beneath the triumphalism ran a current of something deeper and more primal. The joy of children who'd hidden under desks now dancing in streets their teachers had told them might someday glow with radioactive ash. These celebrations weren't just about winning, but about surviving, about reaching the other side of a long, dark tunnel where annihilation had waited patiently for 45 years. They cheered not just for America's victory, but for humanity's continued existence, for the simple fact that the Cold War had ended cold rather than erupting into the thermonuclear holocaust that had haunted their dreams since childhood. The VFW Hall in Columbus, Ohio, sat thick with cigarette smoke and silence, despite the television in the corner broadcasting. Celebration footage from cities across America. Thomas Bradley, who'd carried a rifle through frozen Korean valleys 4 decades earlier, stared into his whiskey glass like it held answers to questions he hadn't known he was asking. Beside him, Ray Nguyen, who'd lost half his left foot to a Viet Cong mine in 1968, watched younger veterans slap each other's backs in congratulation, their laughter sounding hollow against the wood-paneled walls, decorated with fading photographs of men who'd fought proxy battles against the enemy that had now simply evaporated like morning fog. The victory parties playing out nationwide felt like celebrations for a game that had ended before the final inning, leaving those who'd actually played feeling somehow irrelevant to the final score. Bradley finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of winters spent on the 38th parallel, watching for Soviet-backed divisions that might pour south at any moment. He talked about friends who'd frozen to death in sleeping bags, about the terror of Chinese horns echoing through mountain passes, about coming home to a country that couldn't decide whether Korea had been a war or a police action. Now television commentators spoke casually about how the Cold War had been won without direct conflict, as though the blood spilled in rice paddies and frozen hills hadn't counted because the fighting happened in countries most Americans couldn't find on a map. The younger men in the hall, Gulf War veterans mostly, tried to understand, but their eyes betrayed incomprehension at this strange grief that accompanied victory, this peculiar mourning for an enemy's death. Nguyen traced the rim of his beer bottle, his mind traveling back to jungle firefights, where he'd convinced himself that stopping communism in Southeast Asia mattered, that his sacrifice protected something larger than himself. The official story had shifted over the years. First they'd been heroes, then baby killers, then footnotes, and now suddenly victors in a grand ideological struggle that had concluded while they weren't looking. His daughter had called earlier, asking if he felt vindicated, if knowing the Soviet Union had collapsed made his missing toes worth it, and he'd had no answer because vindication implied a clear connection between cause and effect that he couldn't quite trace. The enemy he'd fought in Vietnam had been farmers in black pajamas, not Soviet theorists in Moscow, and their cause had outlasted the empire that supposedly inspired it. Around them, the celebration continued with forced enthusiasm, veterans trying to feel what they thought they should feel while wrestling with something more complicated than simple triumph. They'd spent their youth as chess pieces in a game between superpowers, had killed and nearly died for strategies devised in distant capitals. And now the board had been cleared not through their victory, but through their opponent's internal collapse. The whiskey tasted bitter. The cigarette smoke stung their eyes, and outside the December night grew colder while America danced in streets that had never known the weight of a rifle or the specific loneliness of fighting wars nobody back home fully understood or remembered. The machine shop floor in Rockford, Illinois, hummed with a different energy the morning after the Soviet collapse. Workers clustering around coffee thermoses during their break, discussing futures they'd barely allowed themselves to imagine. Frank Kowalski, who'd operated the same lathe for 23 years, manufacturing components for fighter jets, sketched calculations on a grease-stained napkin while explaining to younger machinists how peace might finally translate into prosperity for families like theirs. Defense contracts had kept the factory running through recessions and boom times alike, their paychecks funded by taxpayer dollars allocated to counter Soviet aggression. But now those billions might flow toward bridges instead of bombers, schools instead of submarines. The morning supervisor had already mentioned rumors of production slowdowns, yet Frank chose optimism over fear, imagining his daughter's college tuition paid not through overtime on weapons systems, but through an economy freed from the weight of perpetual military readiness. Downtown at Morrison's hardware store, Helen Chang restocked paint supplies while listening to customers debate the coming peace dividend with the fervor of lottery winners planning their winnings. Old Mr. Peterson insisted taxes would drop by half now that Washington didn't need to match Soviet military spending dollar for dollar, while Janet Reeves from the elementary school spoke excitedly about finally funding music programs and library expansions instead of civil defense drills. The television mounted above the checkout counter showed economists in dark suits discussing reallocation of defense budgets, their charts and projections painting pictures of American Renaissance built on savings from a war that would never be fought. Helen remained cautious, remembering how her parents' optimism after the Second World War had been swallowed by Korea, then Vietnam, then decades of nuclear standoff. But she couldn't help calculating what her small business might do without the burden of Cold War taxation. At the county unemployment office, Linda Marshall processed claims while fielding calls from defense plant workers already sensing the darker side of peace's economics. Boeing had announced potential layoffs. Lockheed Martin was reviewing contracts, and smaller subcontractors who'd built nothing but military components for generations now faced markets that no longer needed their specialized products. The peace dividend looked different depending on which side of the defense industry you stood. Victory's spoils distributed unevenly across a nation that had organized entire regions around the business of confronting an enemy that no longer existed. Linda listened to a welder's worried voice on the phone, caught between celebrating the end of nuclear threat and dreading the mortgage payment he might not make if peace came too quickly, too completely. The library's community room filled that evening with citizens attempting to imagine prosperity beyond military Keynesianism, their hopes and anxieties blending into conversations that revealed how deeply the Cold War had structured American economic life. They spoke of infrastructure projects and research funding, of tax cuts and social investments, their dreams colored by relief that their children might inherit a world where budgets reflected peacetime priorities rather than existential struggle. Yet underneath the optimism ran currents of uncertainty, the nagging question of whether an economy built for half a century on opposing Soviet power could successfully transform itself, whether the peace dividend would prove real or merely another Cold War illusion, dissolving like morning frost under scrutiny's harsh light. The officers' club at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana felt quieter than usual. Despite the Friday evening crowd, men and women in uniform nursing drinks, while staring at the mounted television, replaying footage of the hammer and sickle descending into history's archive. Captain Robert Hayes sat with fellow missile operators who'd spent careers in underground silos, maintaining launch protocols for weapons they'd prayed never to fire, their entire professional purpose suddenly rendered obsolete by an enemy's internal collapse rather than military defeat. They spoke in hushed tones about transfer, orders and base closures, about specializations that had no civilian application, about identities constructed entirely around confronting a threat that had simply evaporated like morning fog. The bartender, himself a retired Air Force sergeant, kept the television volume low, as if the news might somehow wound these men and women who dedicated everything to a mission that would never be completed, never be validated by the clarity of actual conflict. Across town, in the base housing complex, Margaret Chen watched her daughters play in the small backyard, while neighboring military wives gathered on her porch, discussing futures suddenly uncertain after years of structured predictability. Her husband commanded a bomber squadron that might not exist in 2 years, their family facing the prospect of civilian life after 15 years of military housing, military healthcare, military community that had cocooned them against the chaos of the outside world. The Cold War had provided something beyond threat. It had offered purpose, direction, a clear narrative in which their sacrifices meant something within a larger struggle between competing visions of human civilization. Now, the wives traded rumors about downsizing and early retirements, their conversations mixing relief that nuclear war had been avoided with anxiety about suburban existence without the structure military, life imposed without the meaningful enemy that had justified every relocation, every deployment, every year of tension. At the Northrop facility outside Los Angeles, engineer David Thornton cleaned out his desk after receiving notice that his entire division would be eliminated by Spring, the stealth bomber project he'd devoted 8 years to, developing suddenly unnecessary in a world without sophisticated Soviet radar networks to penetrate. He'd missed his son's childhood for security-cleared work he couldn't discuss, had moved his family 4 times following contracts that now seemed like monuments to a confrontation that had ended not with validation, but with quiet cancellation. The parking lot filled with colleagues carrying boxes of personal effects, their technical expertise in countering Soviet capabilities now as obsolete as their enemy, their resumes filled with skills designed for a geopolitical reality that no longer existed. David sat in his car, watching the sun set over the facility, trying to feel grateful for peace, while wrestling with the hollow sensation that his life's work had been preparation for a test that had been cancelled, a purpose that had dissolved before it could justify the sacrifices made in its name. In a Virginia suburbs coffee shop, former State Department analyst Patricia Morrison met with other recently reassigned government workers attempting to process what their professional lives meant now that containing Soviet expansion no longer organized American foreign policy or domestic priorities. They'd spent careers studying Kremlin leadership, analyzing Warsaw Pact military capabilities, crafting containment strategies that had structured everything from trade policy to cultural exchanges, their expertise suddenly archaic in a unipolar world. The conversation circled around existential questions disguised as career concerns. Without the Soviet Union to define America against, what did American identity actually mean? What purpose would guide the nation that had organized itself entirely around opposition to communist expansion? Patricia stirred her coffee absently, remembering how the Cold War had provided clarity she hadn't appreciated until it vanished, how the moral certainty of confronting totalitarianism had made every policy debate ultimately simple, how victory felt strangely like losing the compass that had oriented an entire civilization toward something beyond itself. The retirement home television room in Cedar Rapids, filled with residents who'd lived through the entire arc of the Cold War, their weathered hands gripping armrests as the Soviet flag descended in footage that seemed impossible after decades of certainty that this enemy would outlast them. Eleanor Pritchard sat closest to the screen, remembering October of 1962 when she'd packed her children into the station wagon during the Cuban Missile Crisis, driving to her sister's farm in Nebraska because distance from cities felt like the only protection she could offer against the nuclear fire that seemed inevitable. She'd listened to Kennedy's address with her hands shaking so violently she couldn't hold the coffee cup her sister offered. The president's measured words unable to mask the reality that human civilization hung suspended above an abyss that could open at any moment. Those 13 days had aged her more than the decade that followed, every air raid siren test afterward, triggering the muscle memory of existential terror that had wrapped around her chest like iron bands. Across the room, Frank Delacroix sat beside his wife of 53 years. Both of them silent as they processed the collapse of the adversary that had defined their entire adult lives. From college sweethearts through retirement, they'd built their first home with a bomb shelter beneath the garage, spending money they'd saved for furniture on canned goods and radiation suits that now sat in some landfill. Artifacts of a paranoia that had felt like rational preparedness when their daughters were young. Frank remembered explaining to his 8-year-old why they practiced hiding under desks at school, trying to make nuclear annihilation comprehensible to a child who should have worried only about spelling tests and playground games. The space race had given that fear a competitive edge that felt almost hopeful. When American astronauts circled the moon, it had seemed like proof that innovation might triumph over destruction, that the Cold War could be won through achievement rather than extermination. Margaret Wu approached the television as if drawn by gravity, her reflection ghosting across the screen, where Gorbachev announced the dissolution that ended everything her generation had been taught to fear and fight. She'd immigrated from Taiwan in the 1950s, choosing American democracy over communist China with a conviction that had sustained her through decades of watching her homeland threatened by the same ideology that had divided Korea and Vietnam. The Cold War had validated her choice in ways both reassuring and terrible, confirming that the freedom she'd sought was worth defending while demonstrating daily that defending it might require sacrificing everything in nuclear fire. Her children had grown up with maps showing communist red spreading across continents, with news reports of proxy wars fought to contain an expansion that now seemed to have contained itself, collapsing inward under contradictions she'd always believed would eventually manifest. The residents sat together in silence as the news anchors attempted historical perspective that couldn't capture what it had meant to live every day for 45 years, knowing that civilization existed at the pleasure of men with nuclear launch codes, that ordinary decisions about where to live and whether to have children were shadowed by calculations of survival radius and acceptable losses. They'd conducted their entire lives against a backdrop of potential apocalypse that had shaped everything from career choices to faith practices, from political allegiances to the simple act of looking at their sleeping children and wondering if they'd condemned them by bringing them into a world teetering at the edge of self-annihilation. In the University Commons at Berkeley, students who'd been children when the Berlin Wall stood gathered around the mounted television with expressions of astonishment that bordered on euphoria, their textbooks forgotten as they witnessed the end of the bipolar world that had seemed as permanent as gravity itself. Sarah Mitchell stood among them, 22 years old and suddenly aware that her entire generation had inherited a conflict they'd never have to finish, that the nuclear threat her parents had explained during countless anxious dinner conversations had simply evaporated like morning fog under unexpected sunshine. She turned to her roommate with tears streaming down her face, whispering that maybe their children wouldn't grow up practicing where to hide when the missiles came, wouldn't learn geography through maps color-coded by ideological allegiance, wouldn't accept mutually assured destruction as the price of existence. The younger professor, who'd gathered with his students, spoke about possibilities that had seemed like naive fantasy just months earlier, about international institutions that could actually unite rather than divide, about resources that had fed the military-industrial complex, redirecting toward poverty and disease and climate challenges that affected humanity regardless of political systems. His voice carried an excitement that made him sound younger than his years, talking about scientific cooperation that wouldn't be constrained by security clearances and ideological suspicion, about cultural exchange that could happen without propaganda filters, about a generation that might define itself by what it built rather than what it opposed. The students leaned forward as if his words were oxygen, desperate to believe that history had genuinely turned a corner rather than simply paused before the next catastrophe. Jennifer Torres clutched her boyfriend's hand. Both of them exchange students who'd chosen international relations as their major, precisely because the Cold War had made global politics seem like the most consequential field imaginable. And now they were watching their chosen enemy dissolve on live television. She'd grown up in San Diego watching naval vessels leave port for deployments that her father couldn't discuss, living with the quiet understanding that those ships existed to prevent Soviet expansion in waters whose strategic importance she'd memorized before learning algebra. The possibility that her career might involve cooperation rather than containment felt like discovering a door in a wall she'd thought was solid, leading to a room whose existence she'd never imagined. Around campus, impromptu gatherings formed as word spread, students who'd never discussed politics suddenly debating what America's role should be as the sole superpower, whether the peace dividend could fund education and infrastructure, whether the proxy wars in Africa and Latin America would finally end now that the ideological competition had concluded. The optimism felt almost reckless after decades of calculating survival odds, like removing a weight they hadn't realized they'd been carrying until it lifted. They spoke of a new world order built on cooperation rather than opposition, on shared humanity rather than ideological division, their voices rising with hope that felt both thrilling and fragile in the December air. In the wood-paneled basement of a VFW hall outside Cincinnati, Robert Harrison raised his glass of whiskey with hands that trembled not from age, but from vindication, his voice cutting through the cigarette smoke as he declared to the assembled veterans that every single person who'd called them paranoid fanatics owed them an apology now that history had proven them right all along. The men around him, faces weathered by decades of watching liberal politicians and academic elites dismiss their warnings about communist expansion, nodded with expressions that mixed triumph with bitterness, remembering the faculty lounges and newspaper editorial boards that had mocked their concerns as hysteria while the Soviet Union built missiles aimed at American cities. Harrison's daughter stood near the doorway, uncomfortable with the satisfaction in her father's voice, recognizing that his need to be proven right had become inseparable from his identity during her entire childhood. The conservative radio host broadcasting from his studio in Atlanta spoke with an energy that bordered on euphoria, reading letter after letter from listeners who'd endured years of being called warmongers and fearmongers for supporting military spending and opposing détente, their voices crackling through phone lines with the relief of people whose warnings had finally been validated by events. He mentioned professors who'd praised Soviet healthcare and intellectuals who'd apologized for Stalin's excesses, asking where those voices were now that the workers' paradise had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, now that the breadlines and shortages and political oppression they'd dismissed as Western propaganda stood exposed for the entire world to witness. His callers spoke about family members who'd refused to speak to them over political disagreements, about colleagues who'd treated them like primitive relics for believing in American exceptionalism, about the subtle social costs of maintaining unfashionable convictions through decades of cultural change. Margaret Brennan sat in her immaculate living room in suburban Phoenix, watching the coverage with her husband beside her, both of them remembering the dinner parties where guests had accused them of paranoia for keeping emergency supplies and supporting defense budgets, where sophisticated friends had suggested that accommodation rather than confrontation was the enlightened approach to Soviet relations. She thought about her sister, who'd stopped inviting them to family gatherings after too many arguments about whether communism was truly a threat or simply a different economic system, about the condescending patience in her voice when she'd suggested that Margaret's fears were products of propaganda rather than legitimate concerns. The validation felt hollow because the people who'd been wrong would simply move on without acknowledgement, would find new causes and new certainties without ever admitting that working-class conservatives had understood the Soviet threat more clearly than credentialed experts. At a church gathering in rural Tennessee, the congregation whose members had been dismissed as backwards for their anti-communist convictions throughout the Cold War decades now spoke about divine providence and the triumph of freedom over tyranny, their pastor reminding them that faith in American values had sustained them through years when cultural elites had suggested that history was moving in socialism's direction. They'd raised their children to understand that some truths were worth defending regardless of intellectual fashion, that the mockery of sophisticated people didn't make their beliefs less valid, that patience and conviction would eventually be rewarded when reality asserted itself against ideological fantasy. Thomas Chen stood at his kitchen window in suburban Sacramento as December darkness fell early across his neighborhood, watching his children play basketball in the driveway, while his mind processed the strange emptiness that accompanied victory. The disorienting sensation of a 45-year struggle, ending not with apocalyptic confrontation, but with a whimper broadcast on evening television. He'd built his entire adult life around the certainty of Soviet opposition, choosing his career in aerospace engineering, teaching his kids about freedom's fragility, organizing his worldview into clear categories of right and wrong. And now that organizing principle had simply dissolved, leaving him grateful but unmoored in ways he couldn't quite articulate to his wife. The relief was profound and genuine. The knowledge that his children would grow up without nuclear nightmares lifting a weight he'd carried since his own childhood. Yet underneath that relief lurked an uncomfortable question about what Americans would become without an existential enemy to define themselves against. He remembered his father returning from the Korean War with warnings about communist expansion that had shaped their family's politics for decades, and wondered what warnings he would pass to his own children now that the maps had been redrawn and the certainties had crumbled. In a cramped apartment in Brooklyn, Maria Kowalski sat with her elderly mother who'd fled Poland in 1946. Both of them watching replays of the Soviet flag being lowered while tears streamed down the older woman's face, her hands clutching a rosary as she whispered prayers of gratitude in a language she'd forbidden herself from. Speaking for decades out of fear, the younger woman felt the weight of inherited trauma beginning to lift, generations of stories about midnight arrests and disappeared relatives and borders that trapped millions finally reaching something like resolution, though she knew the scars would remain long after the political systems had changed. Her mother spoke about relatives still living in Warsaw who might now visit freely, about returning to see her childhood home after 45 years of separation, about the miracle of outliving the system that had destroyed so much of what she'd loved. They sat together in the television's glow, processing emotions too complex for simple celebration, grateful for survival while mourning everything that had been lost along the way. At a diner in Cleveland that stayed open late for factory workers changing shifts, conversations at the counter mixed triumph with uncertainty as men and women who'd spent their working lives building components for defense contracts wondered whether the peace dividend everyone celebrated would include their livelihoods or simply mean unemployment in communities already hollowed by economic change. The waitress refilling coffee cups mentioned her husband's National Guard unit potentially facing cuts, her voice carrying worry, disguised as casual observation, while the customer beside her insisted that America would find new purposes and new challenges now that it stood as the world's sole superpower. They spoke about hope carefully as people who'd learned not to trust promises too readily, who understood that historical turning points looked different from kitchen tables than from podiums, who'd survived too much to believe that Cold War's end meant all their problems were solved. The television in the diner showed President Bush speaking about a new world order, his words promising stability and cooperation, while the assembled workers listened with expressions that mixed pride in their nation's endurance with questions about what victories meant for people whose towns were dying, regardless of which flags flew over which capitals halfway across the world. What do you think America lost when it lost its defining enemy? Subscribe to explore more untold stories from history's turning points.